Good morning, everyone. I'm Paula, and welcome to SewSpark Studio. And a special welcome to SewSpark kids and all of you interested in learning how to sew. This is the third in our lesson series, and it's an exciting day because today we're going to be threading the sewing machine. So it's a bit of a challenge to do this as a teacher because there are so many different sewing machines out there. But I have 3 different models of machines that I'm going to be demonstrating for you today. And definitely some of the features on all of them will be similar to the machine you're using. So you can choose how you approach this. I'm going to introduce you to the sewing machines and you can decide which one is most like yours and watch that section of the video. And you can find that by going to the video description and clicking in the table of contents. Or if your machine seems different from the ones I'm showing you, you can look for a video on YouTube for your own machine, or you can check your instruction book. And so then once you've had some time to watch the video to learn how to thread your machine and to practice, I have a challenge for you. I'm going to thread 2 of my machines and time myself, and then I want you to see if you can beat me. And I'll show you in the video how you can share your results with me. Now, before you get started, I want to remind you again about safety. So if you are young, you should have an adult or someone who's knowledgeable about the sewing machine who can help you if you have any challenges. Also, we're going to be working with the machines and threading the machines, so your hands will be close to the needle. You want to make sure that either your machine is turned off while you do this, or if you need the light in order to see better, that you make sure that your foot is nowhere near the foot pedal. And of course, as always, anytime you're doing anything on your machine when you are not sewing, you should not have your foot on the foot pedal. So I'm going to introduce you to our 3 sewing machines, and then you can get started working on practicing and learning about your own sewing machine. This is the Janome MemoryCraft 6600. This is a computerized machine which has a number of features. One of them is that it does have 2 motors, so it has a separate motor to wind the bobbin, and you can actually wind the bobbin and sew at the same time, although I don't prefer to do that. It also has a tension dial as opposed to tension, which is in a slot in the sewing machine, and it is a top-loading bobbin. And so if you have a machine with a dial or a top-loading bobbin, you're going to see some tips and things that will help you with those parts of the machine. This is my Pfaff Tipmatic 1027. This is quite an old Pfaff, but there are a lot of the threading features that are similar to their newer models. And if you have a machine with a front-loading bobbin like this one, the threading of that is exactly the same no matter what model sewing machine you are using. This is the Janome 4120 QDC. It has the tension in a slot on the front of the machine and features a top-loading or a drop-in bobbin. The bobbin is a clear plastic disc that typically does not come with thread, and so we put thread on the bobbin to match the thread that we're going to be sewing with. And so I have a spool of thread and I will be filling the bobbin. Now on this particular machine, the spool pins are in behind, and there are 2 of them. I'm just going to use one of them. Note about your thread. Most threads have some kind of a mechanism to secure the thread so it doesn't unwind. This one, it's this kind of rough area on the bottom. This should be on the bottom or sideways if your machine has a sideways spool pin, so that these are out of the way and the thread doesn't get caught in them when you're sewing or winding the bobbin. So I'm going to put that on the bottom. Now I do have spool caps. I'm going to use it. I wouldn't have to on this machine, but I do use them. The flat side always goes towards the spool. And then this machine has a thread stand, which would not be typical on a smaller model of a machine, but this is a professional model. So you just run your thread into that stand, and then there's a thread guide right here. Thread goes into that, and then you go straight across And over here we have the bobbin winder tension. It looks a bit like a screw on the top of the machine. And on this machine, you go around behind it and then in front of it, and you pull the thread right between there. There's kind of a gap that the thread gets pulled into, and you can feel that it puts a bit of tension on the thread. If you forget to do this, the thread will be too loose on the bobbin and it won't sew properly. So you want to make sure you don't forget that. Now, some bobbins or instructions will tell you to wind the thread around the bobbin. I find when I do that, sometimes the thread pulls off when I start to wind it. So I prefer to use the hole. And most bobbins have a hole, at least one. Some of them have several. And when you use the hole, you want to thread from the inside of the bobbin to the outside. That's very important. If you do it the other way, you can end up winding thread on the post, and then you have a mess to clean up. So inside to outside, and then you just push the bobbin onto the post, and the thread should be coming off the hole on the top of the bobbin, not underneath. If it's underneath, you'll end up winding thread onto the post. Then on this machine, you push over this part of the machine right here. And what that does is engage the bobbin winding mechanism. Now, I actually haven't turned my machine on yet. You need to do that when you're winding a bobbin. And then this one actually on the computer screen tells me to push the key. And so because there's a separate motor, I don't need to use my foot pedal. There's a button here with a picture of a bobbin. And I just press that button and it will start to wind. Once it's wound a little bit, I like to cut this thread off. You don't want any threads hanging out of that hole, because that can cause your machine to jam up. It gets caught when you start sewing. And then once you've trimmed that thread, you can carry on and finish filling your bobbin. Now, I'm not going to fill the whole thing today, but if I did fill the entire bobbin, this part, this mechanism would automatically disengage, and then your thread is all ready for threading the machine. I'm using a different color thread to thread the top of the machine so that when I have it all threaded, it's easy for you to tell the difference between the top thread and the bobbin. And this one has a little different mechanism on it, but it still has a slot to put the thread into, so that I'm going to put on the bottom. Now again, normally if I use the same thread that I filled the bobbin, you could just leave it on the spool pin. And again, I'm going to put my cap on the thread. And the thread goes into the stand, same as winding the bobbin, and into the thread guide. Then as we come across, now the bobbin winder tension is only used for winding the bobbin. I'm not going to use this. But this is attached to a piece that is a thread guide. And so you slide your thread into the back of that. I can actually hear a little tick when the thread is in position in that part of the machine. And then right here is another thread guide. And these thread guides are there to keep the thread moving in the right direction, and so it doesn't get tangled while you're sewing. And right in front of it is a slot, and I'm going to go straight down this slot. Now, if my machine didn't have the dial that it has, and I'm going to do a close-up of that area in a minute, then this slot here would have the tension for the thread in this slot. And when you're threading through there, it is very important that your presser foot is up, because if the presser foot is down, the tension discs are closed and the thread may not go into them correctly. So you always thread your machine with your presser foot up. And now I'm going to go into the tension on this machine, and I'll give you a closer view of what's happening with that. And so I just brought my thread down the slot that was in front of the thread guide, and then I go underneath the tension towards the back here. And there's a little wire here. I need to pull my thread up and pull on that wire so that the thread catches in a little hook that's in there as well. So then this thread is now going to go up this slot right here. And the take-up is in this slot, and I'm looking for it, but I can't see it. If you can't see it, it means you need to turn your hand wheel towards yourself until you can see the take-up in the top of this slot. And mine doesn't come out very far, but I can see that it's up there. And you go behind the take-up to the left, and then you pull your thread up and forward so that it comes right into the front of the take-up. If it just kind of slips around the back and stays there, it might come off, and then you come straight down this slot again. And then there's a thread guide right here, and you just slide your thread into that. There's another thread guide at the top of the needle, and you just slide the thread into that. And then the challenging part, you need to thread the needle. You need to thread the needle front to back, and I don't recommend taking it out to do this. I quite often will put my finger behind it because I can see the hole more clearly when I do that. And by the way, when you do this, make sure your foot is nowhere near the foot pedal. And needle's threaded. And then there's a little groove in the front of the presser foot, and I usually slide my thread through that groove and back behind so it's out of the way. The top of the machine is threaded, and now we'll do the bobbin. This machine has what is called a drop-in bobbin. This is the throat plate, and the bobbin area has a cover on it. This is how you open it. There's a little button here, and you push it to the side, and this will just snap off. And so what we have here is the bobbin case that will hold the bobbin. So you take your bobbin, and it's important that you put it in the right way. So if you look at your bobbin, the thread's coming around here. And if you imagine this as a letter G, that is not the way you want to put it into the bobbin case. You want it to be a letter P. So very important that the thread's coming around to the left over the top of the bobbin, letter P. And then you're going to take your bobbin and put it into the case. And it just drops in. Now, you've learned about a tension for winding the bobbin and a tension that's on the top of the machine when you're threading. There is also a tension in the bobbin area. So if you look at the bobbin case, there's this little silver piece at the front of it, and almost right at the center front, there's a little kind of indentation. And that is where the tension is. So you want to slide your thread in that little dent, and then you pull it over to the left, and you can feel the tension on the thread as you pull it, and you can see how the bobbin is spinning. Sometimes I will put my finger on the bobbin so it doesn't spin while I'm doing that. Now, we're not quite done. We want this thread to come up underneath the presser foot through the hole that's just underneath the needle that's in between the feed dogs on the machine. On this machine, there are two ways to do that. So this way of getting the bobbin thread is the same no matter what sewing machine you're using. First, you need to hold the thread that's coming out of the needle. If you don't hold this thread, it will basically disappear in the bobbin case, and you can use your scissors to pull it back up, but then you have to do it again. So I'm holding my needle thread, and then I'm going to turn the hand wheel towards myself. You can see the needle going down. Now the needle's coming up, and I'm watching the thread take up. When it's at the top position, I'm going to pull on the needle thread. And you can take your scissors, and there's a loop of blue thread there. That is the bobbin thread, and I'm just going to pull that through. And then my machine is ready to sew. But I'm going to show you the other way of pulling up the bobbin thread here. So the second way, and again, not all machines have this, but this particular machine has this button right here with triangles on it. If you push that button, it moves the needle. So I can push, oops, need to turn the machine on. So I can push this button once and the needle will go down. If I push it a second time, the needle comes up, and basically it's done the same thing as turning the hand wheel did, with just 2 pushes of that button. Then you can cover this up and you're ready to sew. Once you're threaded, if you want, you can get some fabric scraps. These are just from my scrap bin, and try out your machine with thread in it. Now, it's super important when you sew with thread that you remember to put the presser foot down. If you forget to do that, my machine will beep at me and tell me to put the presser foot down. But a lot of machines won't do that. And if you sew with the presser foot up, it is going to make a thread jam. And it will sound funny too. You should learn how your machine sounds, because often you can tell something's wrong just from the sound of your machine. And if you stop sewing quickly, you can prevent big thread jams that take time to fix. So I've got this set for a straight stitch. My length's on 2.5, and you can do some sewing, practice with your reverse button. Don't forget about your speed. My speed's on the high setting, but I'm using my foot to control my speed here. If you want to try with different lengths of stitch, you can do that. Try it on 4, try it on 1.5. And then if you want to set it for a zigzag, try that out. You can see that a lot more easily with thread. So those are just the 2 rows that I sewed here. And then the back has that blue thread, and I'm looking at my zigzag and it looks like my tension needs a little bit of adjustment. See how much of the red thread you can see? I shouldn't be able to see that much of it. So that tells me I need to adjust my tension. But tension is not something I recommend you play around with when you're learning. If you're not sure about that, that's something you should talk to the person who's helping you out with and have them do it, because normally on the sewing machine, when I'm teaching students to sew, I tell them not to touch the tension dial. If you change it, it can be fixed, but it does take time because you have to test it out and make sure you've got it right when you fix it. Every sewing machine, the tension can be slightly different depending on the machine. Do some playing around. If you want to practice, you could take those pages where we did the stitching on paper and do some sewing on those as well. Practice your threading, get good at your threading, and then watch my thread challenge and try it out yourself. Bobbins come in plastic or metal discs like this. They are specific to a sewing machine, so you want to make sure that you have the right size for your machine. And one of the first things we do when we're sewing is put thread on the bobbin for whatever project we're making. I have a spool of thread here. Now, this thread has a rough part at the bottom to secure the thread so that it doesn't unwind when you're storing them. And you want that rough part to be away from the way that the thread feeds, because the thread can get caught on that. And so whether you're sewing or winding the bobbin, when you put the spool onto the spool pin, the thread secured part of it should be towards the inside of the machine. And then you put the cap on. The flat side should be tight against the thread to hold it in place. Otherwise, the thread will pull off when you're winding the bobbin or when you're sewing. The next thing that you do on this machine and almost on any machine, is you run your thread into the bobbin winder tension. There needs to be pressure on the thread when you're winding the bobbin. If the bobbin is too loose, it won't sew properly when you're sewing. Now on the Pfaff, the thread goes around the bobbin from the bottom to the top so that it actually crosses. Not all machines do that. So if you have a different machine, check the instructions for your machine. Now, a lot of machines will say to wrap the thread around the bobbin when you start winding it. I find when I'm winding that if I do that, the thread will pull off when I start quite often. So I prefer to run my thread into an opening in the bobbin. And on these Pfaff bobbins, there's one on each side, but you need to thread from the inside, the center of the bobbin, to the outside when you do this. If you thread outside to inside, you can end up putting thread on the bobbin winder post instead of on your bobbin. So inside to outside, and then you want this thread coming through on the top, not on the bottom. Now, one thing also that this machine has is on this bobbin winder device, beside the post, there is a little tiny post that sticks up, and I need the hole on the back side of the bobbin to fit onto that post. And that helps to hold the bobbin in position. It won't wind if I don't do that. And then you take your bobbin and push to the right. And that's a very common feature on many machines when you're winding a bobbin. Now, this machine has one extra step. A lot of newer machines have removed this step. So when you push the bobbin over, it will disengage the needle. The needle should not be going up and down while you're winding a bobbin. It's a safety feature. It also saves wear and tear on the machine. If I were to start my bobbin right now, it winds, but see how the needle is moving up and down? It should not be doing that. I have to do an extra step. And again, if you have an older machine, you may need to do this as well. So if you look at the hand wheel on the side of the machine here, there's another little wheel in the center. This is called the clutch knob. And in order to disengage the needle, I hold the outer wheel so it doesn't move, and then I turn the clutch knob towards myself. And it's just a small turn. You can feel when it stops itself. You can't push it any further. And when I do that, now when I'm filling the bobbin, you want to hold this thread so it doesn't pull out, straight up so it doesn't get tangled. And see when I press the foot pedal? Now the needle is not moving. So then I hold this thread just until there's enough thread on there to secure it. And then take my scissors. You want to cut that thread as close to the bobbin as you can so that there's not a thread end on the bobbin. If there's thread hanging out of that, when you actually go to thread your machine, that thread can get pulled in while you're sewing, but it gets stuck basically, and it will cause your machine to jam. So you want to make sure you trim that off. I'm just going to use all the thread. There's not a lot of thread on this spool. And I'm just pressing my foot pedal. Now, if I filled this completely full, it would automatically push back and stop. Now, mine's not completely full, but you don't have to completely fill your bobbin. You can just stop and pull the bobbin back and then take it off. And if I still had thread on my spool, I would just snip it so that it was separate. And so that bobbin is ready, and we're going to now thread the machine. If I had just filled the bobbin and I still had thread on my spool, I wouldn't have to put it on again. I could just leave it there because the spool goes in the same place whether you're filling the bobbin or threading the machine. So thread on the spool pin. Again, this rough part goes towards the inside of the machine. spool cap, flat side towards the spool, and I'm ready to start threading. The first thread guide on this machine is really, it doesn't look like a thread guide, but there's a little groove back here, and I'm going to run the thread into that groove. And that groove goes over to this slot right here. And this is a little different than some other machines that have this type of threading. Some machines go from right to left. The Pfaff goes over to the left and then works its way back to the right a little bit in the threading. So there's a slot right here, and you see that silver piece here? This is where the tension on this machine is. And basically I just run my thread down that slot, and it can go on either side of this piece of metal that's here. Both sides will work. Now this dial I call the do not touch dial for my students. This sets the tension, the amount of pressure on the thread here, and every machine is adjusted individually to have the perfect tension. And so if your machine's already been set properly, you don't want to mess with that. When you get more experienced, there will be times that you may change that. But as a beginner, I usually say don't touch that dial. I've come down this slot past the tension, and at the bottom here, I'm going to do a U-turn. So I go underneath this part that sticks down a little bit, and then I go straight back up the slot that's beside it. Now this slot has the take-up lever, but right now I can't see it, and you do need to be able to see it. So I'm going to turn my hand wheel towards myself, and there's something that I forgot to do after I wound the bobbin. Remember how we disengaged the needle? Well, I'm turning my hand wheel right now towards myself, and nothing's happening over here. And that's because I have to reset the clutch knob. So again, you just hold the hand wheel and turn the clutch knob away from you. And now when I turn that hand wheel towards myself, you can see how the needle is moving. And my take up is now in the top position. And I need to be able to see it. So I'm going to take this thread, go behind the take up towards the right on this machine, and pull so that the thread comes into the very front of the take up. If the thread is not in that part of the machine correctly, it will cause a thread jam when you start to sew. This is probably one of the most common threading problems that I see, is forgetting to make sure your thread's in the take up. And then you come back down the same slot. And this time I'm going to slide into this thread guide right here. At the top of the needle, there's another thread guide. Just slide your thread into that. And then the challenging part, you need to thread the needle. It threads from the front to the back, or it won't sew properly. Now, if you need more room, you can put your presser foot down. You should not thread the rest of the machine with the foot down, because when you put the presser foot down, it closes the tension discs and the thread might not go into them properly. So I always thread the machine with the presser foot up, but you can thread the needle with it down. I like to put my finger behind it, and it helps me to see the hole a little more easily in order to thread the needle. And then just pull it through. And foot back up. And then there's a groove in front of the presser foot, and I just like to run my thread through the groove and out behind the machine so it's out of the way when you're ready to sew. The top of the machine is threaded, and now we're ready to do the bobbin area. In a machine with a front-loading bobbin, the bobbin area has a separate case that the bobbin goes into before you put it in the machine. So there is a way to put it in the case if you want a proper stitch when you're sewing. So if you look at your bobbin, this thread is coming off of it. You do not want a P. Right now, this is what I call a letter P. You want a letter G. So you want the thread coming around to the right side of the bobbin over the top. So a letter G. And then if you look at the bobbin case, it has this open area in the top of the bobbin case. I'm going to hold it by the handle because in order for the bobbin to seat correctly, that handle needs to be open. And then you just place the bobbin into the case. If it doesn't fit, you might have the wrong size bobbin. It should fit nicely into the case. And then we're not done yet. There's another step. If you look at the side of the case, there's this little groove right here. This groove is where we guide the thread in order to put tension on the bobbin thread. So there's tension on the bobbin winding mechanism. There's tension on the thread on the top of the sewing machine, and there's also tension on the bobbin. So I'm going to just pull the thread into that groove, and then I pull it up, and I keep pulling towards the left because I want the bobbin thread to come out kind of underneath. There's a little hook and a hole there, and that's where my thread needs to be. Now, as I pull on this, the bobbin spins. You can see that, right? So I need to stop that spinning. So I'm just going to hold it with my finger here so that I can actually pull the thread into this area. And so there you want the thread coming right out of that hole. And then that thread can just hang. Now we're going to put the bobbin into the bobbin case. And so there's a hole in the center here that fits over the post that we see there. The opening should be at the top. And you just push it into position there. And it should fit nicely into it. See this little groove on the right side there? The handle points towards that, and that opening is at the top of the bobbin case. Now, we're not quite done. There's one more step. We want the bobbin thread to come through the hole that's under the needle. It's between the feed dogs. Now, in order to get it there, we're going to use our needle thread. You're going to hold the needle thread with your left hand and turn the hand wheel towards yourself with the right hand. Keep turning. The needle is going down. Now the needle's coming back up. And I'm turning until I see the take-up lever at the top. And then I'm going to pull on the needle thread, and I can actually see the bobbin thread here. It's the red thread. And then I can take a pair of scissors and just pull through. And there is my bobbin thread. And again, put the needle thread through the presser foot. Both of these go out back. You can close this door. And on this machine, this is a little platform for a little more sewing space there. You can put that back into position. I have a scrap of fabric here, and now I'm going to do a little bit of practice stitching just to test out the machine and see how it works. And you can do the same with some scraps of fabric. One of the important things when you're sewing with thread is you need to remember to put the presser foot down. If you do not put the presser foot down, first of all, your machine will sound funny. One of the things about sewing is learning how the machine should sound, because if it sounds funny, you should stop right away. And that way you can prevent a big thread jam that takes time to fix. And so make sure your foot is down. And then I'm going to take a few stitches. My stitch length is on 2.5. I'm on a straight stitch. And take a few stitches. You can try out your reverse lever. And this machine doesn't have any speed adjustment, it's just my foot. And when you're done, if your needle stops in the fabric or partway down, I'm going to do that here. You need to raise the needle, you turn it towards yourself. If the needle is not raised fully, if the thread take-up isn't at the top position, when you pull, it will be quite tight. If you keep turning the wheel, it will loosen up. You want to be able to see the thread take up in the top position. What's happening is it's actually halfway through a stitch. and it wants to finish the stitch before it lets go. So there's just a row of straight stitching. I have a different color thread on the bottom. And then try out some different stitch lengths, 4, 1.5, different lengths. If you want, you can also try a zigzag. And again, I need to, on this machine, raise my needle in order to release it. And with thread, you can actually see your zigzag. And on the back, looks good. And so do some practicing. You can practice if you want to print out the stitching on paper sheets that we did. You can stitch them again with some thread in your machine and practice the threading. And then once you feel like you've got it all together, you can watch my instructions for the threading challenge and see how well you can do. Can you thread your sewing machine faster than I can thread mine? We're going to start by winding the bobbin. Your bobbin is a plastic or metal disc, and you want to make sure you have the correct size for your machine, or it may not actually fit in the machine, or it won't sew properly if it does. So the first thing we're going to do is put thread on the bobbin. And so I have a spool of thread here. And when you get thread, usually there is some kind of method for securing the thread so it doesn't unravel when you're storing it. On this particular spool, there's these rough edges at the bottom of the spool. And if you're sewing or winding the bobbin, the thread can get caught on that. So you want to make sure when you put your thread on the spool pin that those rough edges are towards the outside of the machine here. And that way the thread will feed more smoothly. And then most machines have a spool cap, and you want the flat side of the spool cap against the thread, and in fact right tight against the thread. And this keeps the thread from coming off, because when you're sewing or winding the bobbin, if the machine is moving quickly, it can actually pull the thread right off. Next, you're going to put this thread in the bobbin winder tension. The bobbin winder tension looks like a screw on the top of the machine, and there is a middle area here that the thread will actually slide right into. In fact, I'm going to pull a bit to make sure it's in there. You need tension on the thread when you wind it. If there's no tension and it's too loose, it may not sew properly in the machine. So you want to make sure you don't forget to have your thread running underneath that part of the machine. And then some instructions will tell you to take your thread and wrap it around the bobbin to start winding it. I don't prefer to do that because I find when I start winding it, quite often it will pull off. So I like to use a hole in the bobbin, and almost all bobbins have at least 1 or 2 holes. And I'm not fussy about which side of the bobbin you do this on, but it is important that you thread from the center of the bobbin to the outside. If you thread from the outside to the center, you can end up winding thread on the bobbin winder post instead of on the bobbin. So thread coming from the inside to the outside, and then you put this on the post, and you want to make sure this thread is coming out of the top hole, not the bottom one. Otherwise, again, it will wind on the post, and you just push it onto the post here. And then you push the post over to the side. Now the machine's not on, so I'm going to quickly turn it on. And this particular model will actually show in the computer screen that I am set up now for winding a bobbin. And pushing over, like I just did, also disengages the needle. When you're winding your bobbin, your needle should not be moving. And if it's moving, then you've missed something in the process of setting up, and you should check your instructions. Now, to start out with, all I'm going to do is push the foot pedal. I usually wind with the speed on a higher setting if you have a speed setting. Some instructions will tell you to use a lower setting because it will wind more evenly. So when you start, you want to hold this thread up so it doesn't get caught in the thread as it winds on the bobbin. And I just put a little bit of thread to start in order to secure it. And then I'm going to cut off this thread. And it's very important that you cut this close to the bobbin, because if you have a long thread coming out of this hole, when you use it in the machine, that thread can get caught and jam the machine when you're sewing. And then you push your foot pedal. And in this case, I don't need a lot of thread on my bobbin, so I'm going to stop. If I filled my bobbin, this mechanism would actually cause the bobbin to push back and stop winding once it was full. But you can stop it whenever you want, and then you simply use your scissors to cut your thread, and then you have your bobbin that's ready for when you're threading your machine. If I was using the same color thread I just put on the bobbin, I could leave my spool on the spool pin and then thread for the machine that way. But I'm going to use two colors so that you can see the difference as I'm working with the machine. So I'm going to put this pink thread on top. Now this one is a little different. The thread secured area here is not as rough as on the other one. It actually has it on both sides. So on this one, I just do it so the thread comes up from behind and over the top and on the spool pin. And again, the cap flat side against the thread. So to start out with, the first thing you do is go behind a thread guide. And this machine actually has numbers and arrows to guide you in the threading. So number one is this thread guide. Now the bobbin winder tension's at the front of it, but we're going to work at the back area here, and you simply pull the thread behind and pull it forward. And sometimes you can hear a little quiet tick as you do that. And then there's a number 2 here that shows straight ahead, and I'm going to start down this slot right here. This slot contains the tension discs, and this dial here sets the amount of tension or pressure on the thread. When you're learning to sew, I call this the do not touch dial. It should be adjusted for your machine. It is specific to a machine. I can't just say use number 4. I need to actually sit down with the machine and test it and set it. So I tell my students, don't touch this. So you're going to go down past the tension. Now, one other thing to remember when you're doing this is that your presser foot should be up. If the presser foot is down, there's 2 discs in there and they close. And if they're closed, the thread doesn't necessarily pass between them correctly and the machine won't sew properly. So you want to make sure the presser foot is up as you thread through the top of the machine. So I'm going to come down, and then there's a little U-turn arrow here. So I'm going to go around the bottom of that and come back up. And now I'm looking for my thread take up, and I actually can't see it. And so what you do then is you turn the hand wheel towards yourself, and you keep turning until you can see the thread take up at the top here. And now I'm going to do another U-turn. I'm coming up on the right side of the take up, and that's important, and going behind it, and then you pull up and forward, and your thread needs to come right into the front of the take up. If it's just around the back, it can slip off when you start sewing, and then the machine won't sew properly. And then you're going to come straight down this slot again. At the top here, just at the bottom of where you see this number 5, there's another thread guide. And you just slide your thread behind that. There's a thread guide also at the very top of the needle. And again, you just slide your thread into that. And then the challenging part, we want to thread the needle. The thread goes through the needle from the front to the back. And sometimes my students will take the needle out and try and thread it, and that usually does not work very well. Now, if you find that it's hard to get at the needle, you can put the presser foot down in order to thread your needle, just not when you're threading the rest of the machine. And sometimes I'll put my finger behind it because I find I can see the hole better. And presser foot back up. Now at the front of the presser foot, there's a little groove here. And when I'm sewing, I run my thread through that groove and out behind the machine, so the thread's out of the way when you start to sew. The top part of the machine is threaded, and we're ready to put the bobbin in the bobbin case. This area of the machine is called the throat plate. And in the throat plate is a little plastic door that gives access to the bobbin case. To open this, there's a little black button here. You just push it to the right and the cover pops off. And so this is where we're going to be putting our bobbin. Now there is a right way to put this in the case. So here I'm holding it, and I tell my students it should be a letter P when you put it in the case. So the thread's coming over the top and down on the left side. It should not be a G. If you put it in as a G, there's a part of it that won't thread properly and the machine will stitch, but it won't be a good quality stitch. So you want a letter P, not a letter G. And then you simply take the bobbin and drop it into the bobbin case. Now you're not finished yet. At the front of the bobbin case, there's this little kind of a dent there, or a groove. And I usually hold my bobbin because if I pull on this, the bobbin spins. So I usually hold the bobbin and you pull the thread over to the left into that groove. And what this is the tension for the bobbin. We talked about tension for winding the bobbin and tension when we were threading the top of the sewing machine. There is also tension that needs to be there for the bobbin in order for you to get a proper stitch when you sew. So the bobbin's now in the case, but there's one more step. So we want this thread to come up through the hole that is underneath the needle between the feed dogs. And on this machine, there are two ways to do that. First, you need to hold the needle thread. If you don't hold the needle thread while you do this, the needle thread goes down into the bobbin case, and you can get it back again, but then you have to start over. So I'm going to hold the needle thread, and then it doesn't matter what sewing machine you have, you can use this method on all sewing machines. So I'm going to be using the hand wheel. Turn it towards yourself, and you turn it, the needle is lowering and coming back up, and now I'm actually watching the take-up lever. I want to see it at the top of the sewing machine. And once it's there, I can see the green thread from my bobbin, and I can pull it through, and there's my thread ready for sewing. The second way to pick up the bobbin thread on this machine, it starts out the same. You still hold the needle thread. But this machine has this triangle button up here. And if you push this button, it moves the needle. So I can push it and the needle goes down. I push it again and the needle comes up. And basically that does exactly what I did with the hand wheel, except quicker. And then again, just grab that thread, pull it through, and you can cover up the bobbin area, and you are ready for sewing. Once your machine is threaded, you can do a little practicing. So I have this machine set for a straight stitch, and this particular model, the stitch length does not have a 2.5 setting. It goes 2.4 or 2.6, and either one of those could be a normal straight stitch. And so one of the most important things to remember when you start sewing, especially with thread, is to put your presser foot down. If you sew with the presser foot up, you will end up with a thread jam. Now, if you forget to put it down, quite often the machine will not sound right when you start pressing the presser foot. And so one of the things in learning to sew is learning how your machine is supposed to sound, because that can be a clue to a potential problem. And as soon as you hear a sound that isn't right, if you stop, it can prevent a big thread jam that takes more time to fix. So you just push your foot pedal do a little stitching. You can use your reverse, go forward again. And when you're done, the needle is down here. And so in order to get my fabric out, I need to raise the needle. If I start pulling right now, it feels like it's stuck. It doesn't want to come. I actually need to raise the needle until I can see the thread take up at the top of the machine. And what it's doing is finishing a stitch. If the stitch isn't finished, it sticks. It wants you to finish the stitch. And then you can pull easily and cut your threads. And so this is the right side in the pink thread, and I have the green thread on the bottom. Use different stitch lengths, put it on 4, put it on 1.5, and then put it on a zigzag like we did in the first lesson, and see what it looks like. When you stitch on paper with a zigzag, it looks a lot different with thread. Now on this machine, instead of turning the wheel to raise the needle, I could press that needle up down button and raise it that way and cut my threads. So there's the zigzag and the back of the zigzag. So do some practicing, practice the threading, and then when you think you're ready, go and watch my threading challenge and try it out yourself. So how fast can I thread a sewing machine? I'm not going to use any gadgets on this one, so no needle up down button or anything like that. I have my bobbin and my thread, and I'm going to put my spool cap up here. When I say start, the timing starts. Start. Done. Let's see how I do on the Pfaff. Start. Done. So how did you do on the sewing challenge today? My best time was 20 seconds on my usual machine. I did seconds on the Pfaff. I didn't do a second try, but probably if you do a couple in a row, you'll do better each time you do it. So see how fast you can go. I hope you had fun today. I hope you learned how to thread your machine. Keep practicing it. Practice doing some stitching. And our next lesson, I'm going to give you a couple little sewing activities just to get practicing and to do some things with the machines. We're not going to make anything yet. We're going to do a little practice lesson. And then we're actually going to do some simple projects to get you started using the sewing machine. So I hope to see you again. I hope you had a great time today at SewSpark Studio. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.